All right, now we're going to talk about the lines of evidence for evolution. So now that we've defined that evolution is a change in a population over time, over many generations, what evidence do we have for the fact that evolution is occurring? Well, the first one here, we've got direct observation as a line of evidence. We've got fossil evidence, shared characteristics among living organisms, embryonic development, looking at the progress of development, biogeography, and similarities and differences in DNA. So let's just talk about this first one, direct observation. So in other words, we can see evolution happening. So this might seem strange that we can kind of see evolution occurring, but if you think about it, all we're talking about is the changes that are accumulating in populations over time. So you have to look at a population that has very short generational spans. So in other words, they're able to reproduce very quickly. It doesn't take very long for them to reach reproductive age so that they can produce offspring. And then once again, that offspring doesn't take long to reach reproductive age and then produce more. So such organisms like bacteria are perfect for this. So some bacteria will reproduce every 30 minutes. So if there is a change that occurs within a single bacteria that offers it an advantage and it passes on that change to the next generation, that one survives, reproduce. So within several hours, you could actually see this spread through a population. And we have seen this occur. So direct observation, right? We see these evolutionary changes happening within very short spans of time. So antibiotic resistance is an example of this. With bacteria, we have seen resistance spread quickly for bacteria being resistant to different forms of antibiotics. And we've seen it spread not within just a single species, but it also can jump from one species to another. So antibiotic resistance is definitely something that we've seen. We've seen resistance to different chemicals, different insecticides and pesticides and herbicides, that plants are now more resistant to these chemicals that we've been using for years. So these are direct observational direct observation that we've seen. Okay. The fossil evidence, which was number 2 on our slide there, fossil evidence basically provides a historical record of what has occurred on Earth, kind of shows us what has occurred in the past, showing us the species that occurred in the past and how they have changed over millions of years. So we can find what we call transitional fossils. One of the most famous ones is that of Archaeopteryx lithographica. So this was a fossil that looked kind of bird-like, but also looked like a reptile. So it had a long tail like a reptile, it had claws, and it had wings. And in the middle of the wings were claws. So it was kind of showing potentially a relationship between reptiles and birds, that there might have been a common ancestry between them, kind of showing the steps that evolution might have taken between these major groups. So we consider these to be called transitional fossils. So these are fossils that show intermediate traits between kind of our ancient and our more modern species. Your book gives the example of the whale. So you think of the whale as swimming in the ocean, being an aquatic organism, and then how they have traced it back through time to an organism that was terrestrial, living on land and had 4 limbs. And so having this ancestor and then finding all these transitional species in between that show the changes that accumulated over time from that terrestrial ancestor to the more aquatic whale that we recognize today. So kind of the limbs becoming shorter and the webbing between the feet starting to develop as it moved into water or started to hunt in the water. The changes in the shape of the mouth and the development of a blowhole. So all these we see in each of these different organisms that are represented as transitional species, kind of showing how that path from the ancient ancestor to the more modern species might have occurred. So another line of evidence is of shared characteristics among living things. So such as having similar bone structures, right? I'll show you an image in a moment here of that. So when we look at several different organisms, right, and we can see that they share similar features that they would have inherited by sharing an ancestor. Okay, so shared characteristics, they have similar characteristics because they shared an ancestor, or what we call a common ancestor, from which they would have evolved from. So we have the example here of the human arm and a whale flipper and a bat wing. So if we look at this, they're showing the different bones kind of color-coded in each one of these. So in green, you've got the humerus, that's kind of the long bone of the upper arm, and the whale flipper, it's become a little bit shorter and thicker, and it's still there in the bat wing. All right, but then you've got the radius and the ulna in purple and pink for each one of these, and then you've got your hands and the bones of the fingers, the phalanges, in each one of these becoming greatly extended in the bat. But it's kind of amazing when you think about it that the relationship of all these bones relative to each other, you know, how you got the phalanges at the tip and your humerus at the other end, the relationship of all the bones to each other is still the same. Now, obviously, as humans, we don't use our arms the same way as a whale. The whale's out there swimming, and the bat is up there flying around. So they live in completely different environments, and they're using these in different ways. Now, the structure is very similar, though. So this is kind of pointing back to the fact that every single example here is a mammal. So they all have a shared mammalian ancestor from which they have inherited the developmental sequences, the genes of how to develop these bones in relationship to each other. And there have been some changes that have over time occurred so that one is shorter than another. But they all shared a common mammalian ancestor. So these are shared characteristics, and these are also what we called homologous traits. So they are very similar features, right? Same bone structures, but they have been adapted to different environments, right? So there are homologous structures. We've used that word homologous, so referring to similar, right? So similar bone structures, but very different environments and very different usage. Okay. Over on the right, we've got another image. So instead of just looking at animals, we've got to have a plant example. So we've got cactus flowers and beetroot. And there's also like portulaca stems and flowers belong in this group. They all have a special pigment that's called beta-alanins. And this is a pigment that is unlike other red pigments. So even though members of these plants may not necessarily be very closely related now it shows that they had a shared ancestry from which they inherited the genetic code for how to make that pigment. So even though you've got some that survive in the desert, and some that are producing very thick roots, and where that pigment's being produced, whether it's in the flowers or whether it's in the root, is very different. But once again, all that information came from some type of shared ancestor. We also have what are called vestigial structures. Okay. So vestigial are structures that have lost all of their original function over time, but they're still present in the organism. It's kind of a remnant of their ancestry. So your book gives the example of, it shows a vestigial femur, the little tiny bones there in the whale. So we had talked about its ancestry and its evolution from a four-limbed animal that was walking about on land. Now, for the whale swimming in the ocean, there's no need to have these hind limbs to support its body. So we see that over time, these limbs have become much more reduced. They're no longer functional. And it's just a remnant of its ancestry. So in humans, we like to point to our tailbone or our coccyx as a remnant of a tail that was found in our primate ancestors, or our wisdom teeth, which were once useful for chewing tough plant material, but now not really needed so much because of our diet change. So a lot of different structures sometimes are considered to be vestigial, right? So no longer needed. And then we have embryology. So during embryonic development, many animals that appear to be very different as adults, such as fish and birds and mammals, they actually show kind of a blueprint from a common ancestor as they go through development. So as they're developing as embryos, they all look very similar because that pathway of turning certain genes on and off is similar amongst all of them. So over time, evolutionary changes kind of altered how these features developed and how they were expressed in the adult form, and that leads to a lot of diversity that we see today. But the embryological evidence supports the idea that organisms, though, have descended from common ancestors where they would have inherited these structures. So having pharyngeal gill pouches and tails, so all embryos, that I would just mentioned have started out that way. They all have tails, they all have gill pouches, but even us as humans had them when we started out as embryos, but do not have them as adults. They kind of get turned off. Our genes get turned off and we develop differently. We also have biogeography, which is a study of the geographic distribution of species, and it kind of show how organisms have diversified and adapted to different environments over time. So we can look at species that are found on islands and how closely they resemble those that are on the nearest mainland. So it suggests that they shared a common ancestor, but they evolved separately after becoming isolated if they moved out onto that island, and now they're an isolated population from those on the mainland. We can look at species living in different regions, such as the marsupials in Australia, and that demonstrates how being isolated over time and the different environmental pressures can lead to different evolutionary paths. We see patterns of species distributed across different continents, and that also supports the theory of continental drift, showing how the movement of land masses over millions of years influenced evolution and the spreading of life.